Kathleen Nichols, and I want to welcome you back here to beautiful Magdala. We are continuing with our program, Jewish Feasts and Christianity. And today we're going to be diving into the first part of two parts about the Feast of Tabernacles, or as it's called here in the Holy Land, the Feast of Sukkot. And so for those of you who have been here to Magdala, you might recognize where we are. We're right next to the entrance into Magdala toward Duke and Eltham, and you can see the beautiful palm trees behind us, which is an important part of Sukkot, as well as the high Mount Arbel. And we've been speaking about Rosh Hashanah, we spoke about Yom Kippur, and Mount Sinai, the high mountain in Egypt, was extremely important for those feasts, as is the high mountain for this Feast of Tents, or the Feast of Tabernacles. And so that's why we're here at this point. So what can we say about this feast? 5 days after Yom Kippur officially begins the Feast of Tents, Tabernacles, or Sukkot, which from now I'll refer to as Sukkot. Sukkah is a word in Hebrew which means tent, one tent. Sukkot is the plural of tents, and that's again translated in many ways. If you go through the streets right now and you look at the balconies of some of the apartments where the Jewish people live, you'll see that they've begun to build their tents or their sukkah. And that's because every family is commanded by Jewish law to build one and to live in one. And so after 5 days, the feast is officially begun, and it's a feast of great joy. This is what they call the Feast of Feasts, or the feast par excellence, because it's a feast of joy, and it's one of the 3 times that the ancient Jewish people would have to make a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. They went for Pesach, they went for Shavuot. Pesach is Easter, our Easter, to put it in that time period. Shavuot is Pentecost, and the first time they would go in the year would be now for the Feast of Tabernacles. So again, every family builds a tent, and you see the palm trees here. These ones haven't been recently pruned. They were just a bit before. But during this time of year, you'll notice that they're pruned, so there's almost like just a part that sticks up straight up to the top. And then they continue to expand downward as the palm tree, grows. But they prune them now because they use those types of palm branches to cover the top of their sukkah or other types of greenery, because they want to live a memorial or a solemnity. And remember, a memorial isn't just to remember something, it's actually to live again the graces that happened in the past. So what are they stepping into? What pool of grace are they stepping into now? Well, remember, we talked about how Moses went up the mountain once, came back down, saw what was happening, golden calf, went back up, came back down, had the new covenant. He was up there for expiation of sins, and the people chose the Lord. And because of that, the Lord came down in a cloud and dwelt with the people, and they were able to continue their pilgrimage through the desert after being freed from slavery. So that's what this particular feast celebrates. The Lord is here. We have a tent for Him. We have a dwelling place for Him. We have a dwelling place for us, and we can continue on our pilgrim journey. So the most important thing is this: God pilgrims with His people. God walks with them and He guides them. So that brings us to a second part of this feast that I want to point out. And we don't have any clouds in the sky today. It's a beautiful fall day in the rest of the world. It's still kind of summer here in Magdala. But I was hoping there would be a cloud, because that's one of the key dimensions of this feast. One of the words they use is called Mishkan in Hebrew. And Mishkan doesn't necessarily mean cloud, but I'll explain that connection in a second. It again means dwelling, or the dwelling of God, where the Lord lived, or really where He descended in a cloud. So the Mishkan, where He descended in a cloud. And that's actually interesting. If you look at Leviticus 23, I'm going to read just part of it, starting with verse 41. It's the instruction of how the Hebrews, or the Jewish people, should live this feast. It says, "You shall keep this feast of the Lord for 1 whole week in the year. By perpetual statute throughout your generations, in the 7th month of the year you shall keep it. You shall dwell in booths or tents or sukkot, depending on the translation. You shall dwell in booths for 7 days. Every native-born Israelite shall dwell in booths, that your descendants may realize that when I led the Israelites out of the land of Egypt, I made them dwell in booths. I, the Lord, am your God." And there's one rabbi, it's an old Jewish rabbi, who says something which I think is fascinating. He says that Mishkan refers not to huts or the Sukkot or the booths, but rather it is actually to commemorate the protective cloud and the presence of God among the people. Again, the booth, God, the tents, it's all related, and that's why the word Mishkan is used, because it brings in those elements. So the Mishkan, the cloud of glory or the cloud of presence. As it says in Exodus 13, God would precede them as a cloud, a pillar, or excuse me, sort of this pillar of cloud actually is what it says, and leads them through the desert. It says in Exodus 40, also this cloud came down as the presence of the Lord in the meeting tent. So we're familiar with those things, and that's the Mishkan. But at Jesus' time, when he would celebrate the Sukkot, it's very interesting what they did, which also refers to the cloud. In the temple, they would read this passage and also Deuteronomy in Hebrew, and there would be an Aramaic translation so that people could understand with commentary. And that was an explanation of this Mishkan, of this cloud of glory. And they believed that there were 7 clouds. It's one of what the rabbis say. So think about a hut. The tent or the booth has 4 sides, just like a square. Many times they're white. And each side is representative of God in the cloud defending his people. So that's 4 of them. The 5th cloud, because there were 7, is what they believed in Jesus' time. This one that went before the people to guide them and to prepare a place for them to camp. So the 6th cloud was above them to protect them from the rain, to protect them from the sun, to give them that shade, and to protect them from the heat. And then there was a cloud that was beneath their feet, where their feet were protected from the thorns and from scorpions and from serpents and everything that you might find in the desert. So if you would ever have the chance to go into a sukkah and it's white like that and you're covered with these palm branches, the idea is that you are entering into the embrace of God's presence. It's to help us to remember that he not only protects us above, below, all around us, sort of like that prayer of I think it's a prayer of St. Francis, Christ is before me, behind me, above me, below me. And so here it is. That's what they wanted to bring to underline in this feast. He is protecting, guiding them, embracing them. So it's reliving that experience of being surrounded by the Lord. There's also a very interesting reference, or really a link, between the Mishkan, obviously the meeting tent, and the temple. The meeting tent was a prefiguration of the temple, and that's not just something that comes from our Christian perspective. This is something that the Jews, the Jewish rabbis and the Jewish people back in Jesus' time and even now make reference to. And it specifically points to the Holy of Holies, where God's presence dwelt. And that is a Shekinah. And that's the glorious presence of the Lord that comes down. He sits, it's like a setting down. That's kind of really what it means. He settles and he sets down, and that's what makes the temple holy. If you look at 1 Kings, the book of 1 Kings, there's a whole explanation of when Solomon dedicated the first temple, because he had the first temple built and then they dedicated it. Well, they say, if you read it, it very likely was during the Feast of Sukkot, the Feast of Tabernacles, that the first temple was dedicated. And it was filled, of course, this time of feasting, because the temple was there, of joy and happiness, just like Sukkot is lived today. But it's also when the Shekinah, or this cloud, came down. God's glory filled the temple, it says in 1 Kings 8. So again, this brings us, it's got a lot of dimensions, but it's all surrounded by this idea of God's presence with his people. So what happens today? I mentioned it a couple of times, but already, Jewish people will build their sukkah. They have to build it outside in the open air. It's covered with palm branches, but not completely, because they're supposed to be able to see the sky. And they always say that you're supposed to be able to see the stars. I think it's 3 stars. Maybe it's 1 star. I can't remember, but I think it's 3 stars. And there's a lot of meanings assigned to that. And part of it is because, they have to remember that they were pilgrimaging. When you have to pick up your, dwelling place and then keep walking the next day in the desert, of course, it's not going to be something so solid. But when you talk to the Jewish people, they'll explain to you it's specifically so that we know that we are in God's hands. Not only is he protecting us around these 4 walls, but even from the rain and all this stuff that can come in, he is greater than that. He will protect us from that. And we believe in his providence. So that's part of it. Now, the other thing that happens is they're supposed to eat in it at least once a day, even now. And if you can, you eat all 3 meals there and you sleep in it overnight. So you can imagine how much fun the kids have building the sukkah and sleeping in the sukkah. It's like your own tent that you build in the backyard. It's wonderful, and it's also very joyful. But again, it's to remember that sense of pilgrimage. And actually, they say that today there's a lot of Jewish people who will go from apartment to apartment or down the street, and just, especially on the first day and the last day of Sukkot, which are the most festive days, they'll visit and have a meal and go to the next Sukkot and have a meal with their friends and all this. So it's very interesting. But another point about visiting the tent is that there's a tradition that they receive some glorified guests into their sukkah. And those glorified guests are one for each of the 7 days. It's Abraham, his son Isaac, Jacob, who becomes Israel, Moses, Aaron, Joseph, the one that was sold into slavery, and then David. So they welcome these spiritual guests into their sukkah. And actually, I wanted to point that out because it points to just a couple of the things I want to mention as we finish up this reflection, and that is how it relates to our Christian faith. The dwelling place of the Lord. The dwelling place of God is fulfilled in Christ Jesus. It says in the Gospel of John 1, verse 14, he became flesh and dwelt among us. Or some translate it this way, the Word became flesh and pitched his tent among us. I'm sure you've seen that. Because the Greek word of en hemin actually doesn't even just mean tent. That Greek word means within us. He pitched his tent, or he's dwelling within us. It's referring to the fact that God became man. God is dwelling with us. So we are as well, Christians know this very well from our baptism, we become the dwelling place of the Lord. We really are his tent. And we are his temple, as St. Paul says many times. But I also want to jump to another thing since we've been talking about the cloud, and that is in Matthew chapter 17. And this is where Matthew speaks about the transfiguration. And the reason I mention this is, again, because we're right in front of this mountain here. Tabor, where the transfiguration happened, most scholars agree it happened there, is a very high mountain in the midst of very low valleys. So it's this high place, this mountain, just like Moses who went up to the mountain. It says his face became bright as the sun, and his clothes became white as light. And if you read what Benedict XVI wrote about this, he's a series of books about Jesus of Nazareth, he actually makes this connection. He says, he believes that happened during the Feast of Tabernacles, the Feast of Sukkot, because it says it was 6 days after the apostles were with Jesus up in Caesarea Philippi. And that is where Jesus asked them, who do people say that I am? And Peter says, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. He pronounces the name of the Lord, the same pronunciation of God's name that happens during the Feast of Yom Kippur. And then it says after 6 days, they found themselves on a high mountain. And he became white as light and in this. And then what also happens is that 2 guests come. Remember we talked about those spiritual guests that the Jewish people welcome into their sukkah. The 2 guests are Moses, representing the law, and Elijah, the prophets. So even though Elijah wasn't among the list, or isn't on the list of the 7 people who come to visit the Jewish people in their sukkah, or in their Sukkot, it's interesting to note that there's a relationship between Moses and Elijah. Both of them went up Mount Sinai. There's a valley on Mount Sinai that's dedicated to Elijah, where he hid himself. He was desirous to see the Lord, and the Lord said, I will pass by. And he passed by when there was a wind, and is when Elijah covered himself with his mantle. And then Moses, who desired, let me see your glory, Moses said to him. He wanted to see his face. And so these 2 Old Testament figures wanted to see the Lord. And it's interesting that right there, Jesus is transfigured, and they're having a conversation with him. They see him in that moment. And of course, we all know what Peter said. Let us build 3 tents here. Let us build these tents. And that makes sense if it was during the Feast of Tents. And so it is here that we see that they see the face of God. So there's so much more we could say about this incredible feast of Sukkot. If you know any Jewish friends, you might want to go and visit their Sukkots during these days. Sometimes they fill them with lights, and they're decorated with a lot of fruits, and there's a certain relation with the harvest, which we'll talk about in the second half of this program about Sukkot. But thank you for joining us, and as you look up into the sky, just remember that the Lord's presence is not only with us, among us, He is within us. So we hope to see you soon for the next episode, and God bless you, and know that we're praying for you from the Holy Land.